All right, we're on with our YouTube audience. Hopefully there's some folks watching today or will watch at some point in the near future. We're glad that you're part of our Bible study here today. We are looking at Psalm chapter 50. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at different scripture passages. We're right before Easter. I think there are 3 more Wednesdays after today before we get to Easter, and the last Wednesday I'll probably do something related to Holy Week, more than likely. I know I will. We're going to just follow kind of a scattered pattern for these next several weeks, and then after Easter we will be back in a biblical book from the Old Testament. Haven't decided exactly which one yet. Scotty hadn't told me yet. So once he does, then I'll be able to communicate that to the rest of you all, and we will engage in a regular Bible book study following Easter. So today we are in the book of Psalms, chapter 50. I've given you on the notes that I've given you the general theme. Psalm 50 addresses one of the great themes of the biblical witness, the prophetic biblical witness, the importance of integrity between worship and everyday living. There's worship that you carry out, and you're supposed to carry it out in a certain way, and it's supposed to be carried out in such a way that it is honorable to Almighty God. But the way that it is honorable to God in the end is when it results in or is complemented by righteous living on a daily basis. As we know from the prophetic witness in the Bible, especially Amos, this was one of the things that God took the people of Israel to task for. They were good about going to worship and going through the motions of worship and all the right motions of worship, but they weren't so good about living the high life of holiness that God had called them to. And I've given you a quote in the notes from Amos chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. God, through the prophet, speaking, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fatted beasts, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. What Amos is saying there, of course, is when God's people aren't living the life that they're called to live, when justice is not central to how they live and righteousness is not central to how they live, then the worship that they carry out actually is offensive to Almighty God. It shows the hypocrisy of the people. And so that's the overarching theme, is what we find here in Psalm 50. But Psalm 50 gives us several things to look at and to think about. It really does focus on worship, and it gives us some ways of looking at worship that we probably haven't looked at worship through before, and that's one of the reasons I bring it to your attention today. We'll read through the whole of the psalm, and then we will come back and talk about it in its parts. Psalm 50, beginning with verse 1, the mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes and does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire and a mighty tempest all around him. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare his righteousness, for God himself is judge. Hear, O my people, and I will speak. O Israel, I will testify against you. I am God, your God. Not for your sacrifices do I rebuke you. Your burnt offerings are continually before me. I will not accept a bull from your house or goats from your folds. For every wild animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the air, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. Call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. But to the wicked, God says, what right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline, and you cast my words behind you. You make friends with a thief when you see one, and keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your kin. You slander your own mother's child. These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one just like yourself. But now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. Mark this then, you who forget God, or I will tear you apart, and there will be no one to deliver. Those who bring thanksgiving as their sacrifice honor me. To those who go the right way, I will show the salvation of God. Powerful, powerful psalm, and there's a lot to take from it. And I've kind of divided it up in three sections. Those first verses, verses 1 through 6, we talk about first. And very important things here, even though we typically read over them. The mighty one God, the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes and does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire and a mighty tempest all around him. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me, my faithful ones, who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare his righteousness, for God himself is judge. All of those verses together really kind of help us think about worship from a different perspective than we normally do. We typically think of worship as something, that we come to do, that we initiate. We hold services at 11 o'clock, and so we come together and we initiate worship, and we choose to come or we don't choose to come. And we have kind of this casual understanding of worship. That's wrong. The psalm points us to several important points that need to be held in tension. The whole of the psalm, really the best way to kind of look at it, a larger way to look at it, is to look at it within the context of what we find in Exodus 19. If you go back and read Exodus 19, you will find there the Israelites, after they've gotten out of Egypt and are heading towards the Promised Land, and they end up at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is where Moses received the call, the burning bush, all that kind of stuff. It's God's holy mountain. And so when they come there, God calls them to the mountain. He tells Moses to get them ready to worship him at the mountain. This is his holy mountain. And he tells, for 3 days they have to get ready because they're going to meet God. When they get to the time for the service, they're not to touch the mountain. They're not to get too close to the mountain. They're to maintain distance. Moses goes up on the mountain, and he's up on the top of the mountain, and the top of the mountain is covered with clouds. There's lightning and thunder. There's a whole lot of holy racket, as I call it, signifying that Moses is in the presence of Almighty God on top of the mountain, and the people are down below. That's an excellent image for worship. And that's what stands behind this. God called his people to his holy mountain. He calls them to be reverent, and all the holy racket stuff's going on to make them fear God. And he dispenses his word to Moses, who will speak it to the people. And it's all about calling his people to be his people. He establishes a covenant with them. He gives them his laws, and they are to go forth living as his holy people. So that's that whole scene stands behind what we're looking at here. And basically what we're looking at here is that from time to time, God calls his people into assembly. He calls them into assembly. They are to come and to worship him. And the reason for his calling them to worship beyond their offering thanksgiving to him and honoring him and glorifying him is that he's going to judge them. Are you living up to your calling? That's a perfect understanding of worship. God calls us together every week. In your bulletins, you pay attention to it this Sunday when you get it. The very first line in your bulletin says, the gathering of God's people. That's not a throwaway line. That stands for God has called his people to his house to worship him. God has called you. And it's an extension of the fact that God has called you to be his people. You got called to faith. You didn't choose to become a Christian. That's what you think. That's what everybody tells you. No, God called you. God made himself known to you. God initiated. Well, that's what worship echoes every week. God calls you to worship on Sundays, his holy day. He calls you to his holy house. And there he will judge you, quote unquote. That is, he will continue to speak his word to you. You are to take the measure of your living in accordance with that word, and you are to make an adjustment and amendment accordingly. So he calls you to worship. You know, I know we wake up in the morning and think, I just don't feel like going to worship today. And you think it's up to you, right? It's your choice. No, God called you to get up and come to worship. This is a holy convocation. And so, the first thing we have to get is that your coming to worship is in response to God's call. The call stands out there, and you're making one of a couple of responses. Either you're ignoring it, or you're indifferent to it, you don't think it matters, or you're rejecting it completely, or you're showing up. And so that line is in there to help you remember that you're responding to God's call. You're responding. He's called you to worship him, and you are in the house. We are the called together people. Just as we're the called together people in the church, we've been called out of the world into the church to be followers of Jesus Christ. We've been called together on Sunday mornings to honor God, to worship him, and to hear his word so that we can take the measure of our lives against that high calling to holiness and make adjustment as needed. It's kind of like the military leader who, calls the troops to attention. All the troops gather, they're at attention, and he does inspection. Muster the troops. That's what happens on Sunday mornings, in a sense. God calls his people together so that he may judge them. So there's the sense of calling that stands out here. I mean, the language is it's right there. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. And then the very words, verse 5, gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. So when you come to worship on Sunday morning, you're coming in response to a call. God calls you to worship. It's not optional. He calls to judge his people. We've made a covenant with him through sacrifice. For the Israelites, of course, if you go back and read Exodus 19, and then you read the following chapters, you will see that this is about the Mosaic covenant. God calls them to live by the laws of Moses. He's calling them to be his holy people. And so he established a covenant relationship with Israel there at the holy mountain, the convocation at Mount Sinai. Well, we have been called into covenant fellowship with Jesus Christ, right? Jesus Christ is the sacrifice that was offered up by which we were made able to come into God's presence, to be acceptable to him, to be declared righteous. And so it's the new covenant as we talk about. The New Testament, the new covenant. We are in covenant relationship with God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And so, gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. That speaks to us. We belong to God through Jesus Christ. We are in covenant with God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Call to me my faithful ones, and he's going to judge our faithfulness. God always judges his people. We've talked about this in other settings. The people of Israel, why do they go through punishment? Why do they go through hard times? Why do they go through the Babylonian exile? Because they belong to God, and God called them to walk into holiness. And he sent prophets to tell them to get right when they went wrong. And he sent, various sorts of smaller frame kinds of judgments against them. And then they never would come to him. They never would turn from their sin. And so he brought the big judgment, the big one. Why? Because they are God's people, and they are called to holiness, and they are supposed to live holy lives. So God calls us to himself on Sundays. He speaks his word through the reading of the Bible, through the preaching of the preacher, through the singing of the songs, through the singing of the choir. He preaches his word to his people so that they can take the measure of their living in accordance with their calling as it's made known through the Bible and make adjustments accordingly. There's a lot of stuff there, those first verses. I've detailed several of them there for you, and you can take time to look over them more clearly. But that's the gist of it. God calls us to speak to us. There's this one great quote in terms of the speaking. God uses the preacher, uses the preaching pastor to speak the word. The pastor is responsible for speaking the word God wants spoken to his people so that they can live in righteousness before him. And this is a quote from a writer. The preacher speaks for God from the scriptures by the authority of the church to the people. That says a lot there. The preacher speaks for God. That is no small thing right there. And a lot of pastors need to get a hold of that very, very seriously. The preacher speaks for God. Not that he's self-proclaimed. That's why we talk about ordination being so important. God calls out those who are to lead in the church. It's not because they're better than anybody else or more talented or more handsome or, whatever. No, it's God puts a call on that person because God chooses that person. And then God lays the burden on that person's heart to speak the word that they need to hear. The preacher speaks for God from the scriptures. The preacher's not just up there to give his opinion about world affairs. He's not up there to preach, to point to some book that's really interesting or fascinating. He's not up there to give you a report about what the denominational offices are doing. He's there to preach from the scriptures. He's been given this privilege by the authority of the church. That goes back to ordination. As we've talked about before, ministers who are ordained are always ordained by the church. And so they have to give evidence of their calling to the church, and the church has to validate that. So the preacher is preaching by the authority of the church to the people of the church. But that's how God speaks his word. So God calls his people together. They're his faithful ones who have been brought into relationship with him through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. He speaks the word that they need to hear. He takes the measure of their faithfulness and he calls them to repentance and change, and does so through the word that is spoken. That's kind of a new way of thinking, I think, about worship. A healthier way of thinking about worship, those first few verses, 1 through 6. Again, there's a lot more there in the notes that I gave you that you could look at and think about and talk about on your own. The second section of verses 7 through 15. And it starts off with what we just said, in verse 7. Hear, O my people, and I will speak. O Israel, I will testify against you. I will testify against you. That is, I have judged you, and I will tell you where you are doing well and where you are doing wrong. And the first thing he says to the people of Israel is, you're doing a great job with the sacrifices. Not for your sacrifices do I rebuke you. Your burnt offerings are continually before me. So they're going through the right motions. They're doing the right rituals. But there are two problems to start with in how they view God and how they view their sacrificial offerings. The first issue has to do with they think somehow that God is dependent on the sacrifices for his sustenance, that their sacrifices are food. Now, you know how the Israelites sacrificed. They brought in the animals, they had them killed and cut up, and they had them offered up to God, and they were cows and sheep and all that kind of stuff. And so, it's food, right? Quote unquote. And so somehow they had it in their mind that they were actually doing this for God's benefit, that they were providing sustenance for God. Where'd they get a crazy idea like that? From the pagan religions all around them. And so it's evidence that their understanding of God was not right. They were thinking in terms of the pagans and how they dealt with deities. And so in here God says, if I were hungry, verse 12, if I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine. And then verse 13, do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? No, this is not about feeding me. This is about recognizing your sin and making offering for atonement. And so, the ritual is about you getting back into right relationship. It's not about giving me something I need. So they had a wrong view of God in that particular way. But they also seem to think that by bringing their animals to God, they were somehow transferring ownership of the animals into God's. Here's our stuff and we're giving it to you. Aren't we good? We're showing you how much we think of you because we're taking the best of our livestock and giving it to you. And God's saying, what you have is not your own. It all belongs to me. I already own it. You're not doing me any favors by bringing it. I've put this all on loan to you, and you are returning to me a portion of my blessing to you. This is very basic stewardship thinking here, of course. Everything we have comes from God. He owns it, and he provides it to us so that we can make a living for ourselves and take care of our loved ones. But we're not giving stuff to him because, as if it's ours and we're giving it to him. No, we're returning a portion of what he gave us in recognition of the fact that he gave it to us. It's an expression of thanksgiving. And that's exactly what God is saying to the Israelites here. The thing I want is a sacrifice of thanksgiving. And so they didn't have a right conception of God in those two ways. And he's telling them that so that they can get right, so that when they bring their sacrifices, it will truly be an expression of thanksgiving. Lord, you have blessed us with all this bounty. We are so grateful for it. We return a portion of our bounty that you gave us to say thank you. And getting rid of that whole notion that somehow their sacrifices were feeding God, literally. Again, getting rid of the pagan influences. That points to something, of course, that we need to pay attention to just for a second, and that is we can do all the right things for the wrong reasons in worship. And so it matters that we understand why we do what we do in worship. That's why I don't always, but from time to time I will give you a sermon on worship or a Bible study on worship, because we need to understand what it's about. You can go through the motions and not completely understand why you're doing what you're doing. And so we need to continually remember the meaning behind what we do. And that's on view here. Giving thanksgiving, that's what I love, says God. When you thank me, that's the sacrifice I want. That's what the animals are really all about. Getting right with me, number one, acknowledging me to be God and that you're going to live by my laws, but also giving thanks for my blessing to you in your life. And so giving thanksgiving is the first offering that's acceptable to God. The second offering that's acceptable to God is the plea for help. Truly bring your pleas to me. Don't try to do it on your own. Come to me with your needs. Come to me with your concerns. Give them to me. That blesses me for you to depend upon me, to cast your burdens on me, to live under my leadership and my guidance. Dependence is such a key theme throughout the biblical witness. I've said it on occasions before, and it's worth saying again. In real time, real life, we all think that independence in human relationships is a sign of maturity, right? The adult who has to depend on, mom and dad still at 60 years of age or whatever, or, who can't take responsibility for himself or herself, that's somebody who's immature in our mind. And so we think independence is a sign of maturity. Well, in spiritual life, it's the exact opposite. We start off independent of God. The growth towards maturity is independence upon God, recognition of who He is, understanding that everything belongs to Him, understanding that all our needs are in Him, and giving ourselves into His care and keep. The more dependent we become on God, the greater maturity we are gaining in the spiritual life. And so the key theme there, and it's sounded forth here: give thanksgiving to God, and give your make your pleas to God. How does it go exactly here? Call on me in the day of trouble, I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. Verse 15. Cast your burdens upon me. Acknowledge that I am your God, and depend on me. Verses 16 and following, 16 through 23, bring home the point that we started off talking about, how the worship that the Israelites were going through in this particular instance, this particular setting that the psalm is grounded in, it's not solid worship. It's insubstantial worship, because their lives are not holy. God takes offense. God hates the worship of those who live like the devil during the week. And no matter how heartfelt you are, and no matter how much you understand what you're doing, no matter how sincere you are in worship, if Monday morning you cheat your neighbor and you run down, slander your friends, and you engage in all sorts of other sinful behaviors, your worship is wasted. Your worship is an offense to God. And so verses 16 and following talk about that, raises that issue. But to the wicked, God says, and this is the wicked Israelite, the one who is not living in accordance with God's laws. And this is powerful, verse 16. What right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline and you cast my words behind you. In other words, what God is saying, what right do you have to stand in worship and recite my statutes and to sing my praise? It reminds of James chapter 3, where James talks about, the tongue and the fire that it sets and all that kind of stuff. And James is talking to teachers in the church. And he says, it's a terrible offense when you bless God one moment, and then you turn around and you curse your neighbor in the next moment. How can the same mouth speak the praise of God and then speak gossip of another? It's not supposed to. It's an offense to God. Well, that's what he's saying here. What right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline and you cast my words behind you. And then he lists some of the sins they're engaging in. You make friends with a thief when you see one, and you keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your kin. You slander your own mother's child. You slander your own mother's child. That's your brother or your sister. And the way he puts it, your own mother's child. You know you love your mother. Well, why are you blaspheming your mother's child, your brother? These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one just like yourself, but now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. Interesting there, just for a second, the sins of the tongue, the sins of speech, they get played up really, really pretty powerfully throughout the biblical witness. There are several places in the Psalm that talk about the righteous person in general, and it's always got something to do with right speech, with not gossiping, with not slandering, with not using your speech to deceive others. You know, what we do with our tongues, what we do with our words, what we do with our speech says everything about what's in our hearts. And so Jesus said that. It's not what goes in your mouth that defiles, it's what comes out of your mouth that defiles. Because what comes out of your mouth is what's in your heart. And so a lot of attention is paid to the damage we do with our words in biblical witness. And that's present here as well. We often think when we run down the list of sins, it's all about sex and, greed and, the big item sins, those kinds of things. Speech is always in the middle of it. And it is for that very reason. But the Lord says, these things you have done, and I have been silent. And you thought that was in approval of what you're doing. But now I lay the rebuke against you. Keeping silent and speaking, that's a prominent theme in this whole. If you go back and read the words where he says, like the first verse, the mighty one, God the Lord, speaks. And then he talks about silence. Speaking in silence. God doesn't always call us down on our sin right then and there in that moment. Not, when he speaks, you're pretty much at the end of the rope. That's, it's kind of like the old saying, you knew things were serious. Your mother would keep trying to tell you, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. But when she said, if you don't stop, I'm going to get your father, well, you knew you needed it. It was getting serious. Well, if God's going to speak to you, you're already in deep. You may not be able to get out. That's exactly what God says. Mark this, verse 22. Mark this, then, you who forget God, or I will tear you apart, and there will be no one to deliver. When he speaks, then it's almost too late. But God will speak. And that's the purpose, again, of worship. God is always trying to speak to us and to keep us on track and to show us where we've gone wrong and to show us where we're right and to keep us faithful in our following Jesus Christ. That's what worship, that's one way of looking at worship, a true way of looking at worship. God calls us together. He gathers us to hear his word so that we can get right with him and stay right with him and turn from our sin and stay on the path of faithfulness. He's the military leader who's calling his troops to attention, and he's going to go through and inspect them, and he's going to get them right before, so that they can carry on in their duties. That's exactly what, this way of Psalm 50 points to looking at worship. You don't want to get to the point where God has to literally speak. When you've done something wrong, get right now. Don't think that God is winking an eye at your sin. Get right now, because you will be held accountable for it. One last thing to say about this, all of this, you can think of worship as kind of a weekly exercise to get you ready for the final judgment. Because all this points to the final judgment. You can read this and hear the final judgment in it. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth. From the rising of the sun to its setting, out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes and does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire and a mighty tempest all around him. This is judgment. This is judgment. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. And so judgment, final judgment. And that's what worship points to as well. Weekly, we come into this place and our worship, chastens us and helps us to stay on the path, which helps us for the day of judgment that will come at the end. Have you remained faithful all the way to the end? Our Revelation study emphasized that point again and again and again. Having faith is about staying faithful all the way to the end. Will you persevere to the end in following Jesus Christ? Every week, God calls his faithful ones together to speak his word to them, to judge them. To judge them meaning to take, to hold us accountable and show us where we've gone wrong, and to commend us where we've gone right. So every week he calls us together to inspect us, to help us see where we need to get right and how to continue on in being faithful. And all this is in preparation for the final day, where God will call all people together and will judge all the nations in all the world. A little bit more there on the plate than we really have time to get to today. Any thoughts or questions or comments about all that? There's some notes about things in there that you can follow up on your own. But this is how I look at worship. This has been instructional for me in how I try to go about worship. And if you read those notes, you will see, there's a lot of stuff there. But at this is the way we try to go about worship. We're trying to be serious. God is serious about the life of faith. God is serious about righteousness. And we need to be serious in worship. This is not the time to try and attract people. This is not about entertaining people and giving them what they want. This is about speaking to God's people about God's life. So it's about purifying God's people. If somebody comes in that's not a believer, hopefully they hear the gospel and hopefully it'll make them want to come to Christ. But my main focus isn't on trying to attract people out there to come in here. My focus is on the people of God here gathered and whether they are walking in the ways of righteousness. And this is a foundational text for me on that front. So, anything you want to talk about? You've eaten, you've listened, time to go nap. So, go home. Thanks for